Now it's being recorded. And so for today's event, we are absolutely delighted to host and welcome Mr. Peter Beinart, who is a prominent and renowned American journalist and a leading political commentator. An Orthodox Jew, Peter has written extensively on Israel and Palestine. He has long been a leading advocate of a democratic Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state. However, in recent writings in the Jewish Currents and the New York Times, he has expressed the idea that a two-state solution is no longer possible, and he now believes in a single binational state for Jews and Palestinians where everybody lives as equal citizens. He also supports the right of Palestinian refugees to return. Today, we're going to ask Peter to reflect on his positions, his shift in thinking, and to tell us why he believes that the Jewish community should support Palestinian rights. Now, before we formally introduce Peter, it is my privilege to introduce my two co-moderators for tonight's event, Rabbi Devorah Jacobson and Rabbi Justin David, both of whom are leading lights in the social justice and interfaith movements here in Massachusetts. For the past 18 years, Rabbi Justin David has led and been a rabbi for Congregation B'nai Israel, which is a progressive Jewish community. He is the author of Longing, Jewish Meditations on a Hidden God, and is also the 2018 recipient of the Human Rights Hero Award from TRUA, which is the Rabbinical Call for Human Rights. Rabbi Devorah Jacobson is the chaplain and director of spiritual life at JGS Life Care, a long-term continuum of care campus in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. She teaches adult education classes and is an active member of the Jewish community of Amherst, where she co-chairs the Racial Justice Initiative's Reparations Committee. She also serves on the Critical Connections Board. So before I turn it over to Rabbi David to introduce our distinguished speaker, I'm just going to quickly share the format of tonight's event. So for the first half of the event, the rabbis and I are going to ask Peter a series of questions, after which we are going to open it up for Q&A with the audience. And for the questions, we welcome and invite all perspectives and all questions reflecting all political viewpoints. And we will ask you to submit your question in the chat function, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. However, we will not countenance any personal attacks against our speaker or any racist or bigoted comments against any racial, religious, or ethnic group. So having said that, I am now going to turn it over to Rabbi Justin David to please introduce Peter Beinart.
Thank you, Mehlaqa. Before I introduce Peter, I just want to express my deep appreciation for you, Mehlaqa, and for Critical Connections and all the work you've done over years to bring us together in meaningful and critical dialogue. And also to very much appreciate my friend and colleague, Rabbi Devorah Jacobson, both for the work you do, honoring elders at the Jewish Geriatric Network in Longmeadow, and also, of course, for your singular work in bringing communities together. Right before the pandemic, Devorah was supposed to conduct a seminar at Congregation B'nai Israel, Islam for Jews, and hopefully, now that we're starting to meet together again, we'll find an opportunity to do that. I'd like to introduce you to Peter Beinart. Peter, welcome to the Pioneer Valley. Peter Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He's also a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times and a CNN political commentator, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He writes the Beinart Notebook newsletter on Substack.com. He's the author of several books, including The Crisis of Zionism, which was published by Times Books in 2012. Peter graduated from Yale University, winning a Rhodes Scholarship for Graduate Study at the University of Oxford. And just on a personal note, I want to say how much I appreciate that wherever we land on our range of responses to Peter's opinions, I want to appreciate that, Peter, you very much position yourself as someone speaking from within the Jewish community, and we'll come back to that theme later. And I also want to thank you for being willing to be part of this probing and critical conversation tonight. And with that, I turn it back to you, Mehlaqa.
Thank you so much, Rabbi David. Thank you for that. And I would also like to encourage everybody to see the link that we have put in the chat for Peter's newsletter, the Beinart notebook. I subscribe to it. It offers very interesting analysis on a weekly basis, so please do check it out. So Peter, again, on behalf of all of us, welcome, and thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I'm just going to get to it immediately and ask you the first very obvious question, I guess. You know, you've been a prominent defender of liberal Zionism and the two-state solution for a very long time, but now believe in a single binational democratic state, which is not exclusively Jewish, where Palestinians and Jews live as equal citizens. Could you walk us through the evolution in your political thought and what led you to this current realization?
Sure, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be speaking to a group that brings Muslims and Jews together. I mean, I speak to a lot of Jewish groups, and I may have spoken to a few Muslim groups, but not necessarily such a group as this. So it makes me once again proud to be from Massachusetts, that you've created such a beautiful thing. I long supported, my entire adult life supported the idea of a Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state, because for me, the kind of fundamental tension within Judaism itself, which I've always found fascinating and challenging, is the tension between particularism and universalism, between the fact that we think of ourselves as a people, a kind of extended family, right? In the book of Genesis, you have the story of a family. Then the book of Exodus becomes a people, but still imagined as a kind of family, B'nai Israel, the children of Israel. And I believe that Jews have a kind of familial obligations to one another, quasi-familial obligations. But Judaism is also a religion with a universal ethical message. The first people that we're introduced to in Torah, Abraham, Eve, Adam, Eve, Noah, are not Jews. They're universal human beings, which I think emphasizes the fundamental universal dignity of all people. So I thought the best way to deal with this tension was to have a Jewish state which would be obligated to protect Jews, have a special obligation to Jews, but Palestinians would have their own state. So at least every Palestinians would be citizens of the country in which they live. They would have the kind of basic human rights of at least being a citizen of one country. I think the problem is that over the course of my lifetime, the project of Israel's entrenchment in the West Bank, the primary territory where Palestinians would create a state, has become so deeply entrenched that it's become very difficult to imagine that a Palestinian state could be viable. In the early 1980s, you had prominent Israeli figures, for instance, like Meron Ben-Veniste, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, also prominent Americans like Tom Friedman, basically saying, if you get to 200,000 settlers in the West Bank, it will be impossible to create a viable Palestinian state here. Including East Jerusalem, we now have 650,000 Jewish settlers. And it's not, that alone understates it, because it's not just the population, it's the massive infrastructure. This has been Israel's biggest infrastructure project really since its creation. And Israel only was a country for 19 years before it took control of the West Bank. It's been a country for more than 50 now underneath it. It's virtually impossible to find a map issued by the Israeli government that even acknowledges the existence of the green line between Israel proper and the West Bank. Massive industrial transportation networks, Israel's newest medical school in the West Bank. So I first of all simply think that partition between Israel and a viable Palestinian state is no longer possible. But I also began to think, and these are perhaps even more subversive thoughts that I probably did not think earlier on in my life, that partition doesn't solve some of the deeper questions at play in this conflict. So for instance, two in particular. Generally, the two-state solution is imagined, certainly by most Jews, as meaning that Palestinians would not be allowed to return to their homes or their parents' or grandparents' homes inside Israel proper. It's important in Gaza, for instance. The reason Gaza is so overcrowded is that most of the people who live in Gaza are not from Gaza. They're refugees, or the children and grandchildren of refugees from what's now Israel proper. I began to, over time, doubt whether it was ethical, especially for Jews who, for 2,000 years kind of dreamed of a return to our homeland, and then, astonishingly actually made it possible, to deny Palestinians the right to return to the places where they live after a mere 75 years. That seemed to me a very dubious proposition ethically, to justify the fact that I, as a Jew, can return to Israel, where I've never lived permanently, and become citizen on day one, and yet a Palestinian who was born in Haifa or Jaffa or Sfat or Lod, what Palestinians call Lida, cannot return themselves. The second problem with the idea of partition is that you would still have 20% of Israel's population who are Palestinian citizens. Yes, they're citizens, but they will never be equal citizens in a Jewish state. And I think one of the things that was so striking about this recent round of violence was seeing the violence break out in what are called Israel's mixed cities, in Jaffa and Haifa and Lod. I began to think, do people think that you're going to partition those cities too? I mean, the fundamental problem in Haifa or Jaffa or Lod is not that Palestinians and Jews live next to one another. It's that they live next to one another without equal rights. And just to give maybe just one example, because I think that oftentimes in the American Jewish conversation, we don't reckon with how profound the structural discrimination in Israel, even against Israel's own Palestinian citizens. Put aside those folks in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza who live under Israeli control but are not even citizens. But just look at the question of land. Most of the Israeli land is owned by the state, and it's doled out by something called the Israel Land Authority. Now, the Israel Land Authority devotes almost half of its seats to the Jewish National Fund, right? And which is a Jewish organization whose mission is the development of Jewish life. So to imagine, that's why there's been no new Palestinian town built inside Israel proper since 1948. It's why Palestinian citizens are 19% of the population and live on 3% of the land. Imagine being a Jew in the United States if most of America's land was controlled by an institution that was explicitly devoted to the development of Christian life in the United States, such that if every time a town in Western Massachusetts wanted to develop some new area of the town, it went before a committee whose explicit purpose was for the development of Christian life. That would be just one example of the profound ways in which the existence of a Jewish state means that Palestinians, even those who are citizens, can never be equal. And we would never tolerate that as Jews living in a Christian America, explicitly Christian or officially Muslim America. And so I think the problem is that even if you created a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, you would have 20% of the population that wanted equal rights, as we would. And what if it became 25% or 30% or 35%, right? Under that scenario, every Palestinian child born, rather than being in what we would call a simcha, is a demographic threat, because the danger is the population gets a Jew. And this, I think, points to the fundamental tension between the idea of Jewish statehood, a state that essentially sees one ethnic group as supreme over another, one ethno-religious group, and the principle of equality under the law. And so it was these set of thoughts, none of which are remotely unique to me, that I would say gradually moved me to a position that Zionists, cultural Zionists like Martin Buber had and Judah Magnus had in the 1940s, that Edward Said came to near the end of his life, which was the idea of an equal binational state.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that. And I think it leads us nicely into this next question. What do you say to those of us here tonight who identify as Jews and as Zionists, even progressive Zionists, still living only decades from the tragedy and the trauma of the Holocaust, who feel tremendous fear, loss, and even betrayal at the suggestion of abandoning the only Jewish state that exists in the world, one that offers Jews the promise of physical refuge, of self-determination, and of a revitalized sense of Jewish peoplehood?
So I think the first thing I would say is that I do identify as a Zionist. I identify as a cultural Zionist. Again, probably, Theodor Herzl's great opponent, Achad Ha'am, a man much more steeped in Judaism, by the way, than Herzl was, believed in the importance of a Jewish society in what we call the land of Israel. He did not believe that it needed to take the form of a state. Up until the 30s or even the 1940s, many Zionist thinkers thought more in terms of the idea of communal autonomy than they did within the idea of statehood. So I would say that I do believe in the preciousness of a Jewish society, what I call a Jewish home in Israel, Palestine, that could, for instance, maintain the extraordinary cultural revival that we've seen with the creation of Hebrew as a modern language, for instance.
Yes. Do you know where on there is my list of medication? My medication.
Sorry, since we've got another conversation going on. And I also want to say that for those folks who remain political Zionists, when I say political Zionists, I mean someone who believes in the idea of a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians, who do so because of a fear that in a post-Holocaust world, Jews need one state that is devoted to our protection, even above and beyond the welfare of other people who live in that state. I hear that voice inside my head every day. I also hear it very explicitly from many of my relatives, sometimes who frame it in starker terms than I frame it to myself. But certainly, I feel that my grandmother was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and the family left, and then they moved, of all places, to the Congo, to what's now Lubumbashi, what was then Elizabethville, and then she moved again and spent the rest of her life in Cape Town, South Africa. And I was told endlessly as a child by her, she was a huge impact on me, essentially never to get too comfortable in the United States, that there was only one place where Jews really could be comfortable, and that was the place where her brother had gone in, when he left Alexandria, which was to Palestine, what became Israel. The problem with that, it seems to me, although I deeply understand the impulse and feel that impulse, is that I ultimately believe that our safety and the safety of Palestinians are intertwined. And so I don't believe that in the long run, a state that denies Palestinians basic rights and dignity is going to be a state that provides Jews the safety that we want and that we need. And the reason is because when you deny people basic rights, and again, we've seen this in a certain kind of way even in our own country, right? And this is something that Martin Luther King talked about a lot. That denial of rights is a form of violence. We may not always think about it as violence. We may think that the violence has ended once Israel stopped bombing Gaza and once Hamas stopped sending rockets. But putting 2 million people under a blockade such that the UN says that the Gaza is now unlivable for human beings, that is surely violence. And that form of the violence of Israel demolishing homes, for instance, for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, that form of violence tragically will ultimately also endanger Jews as well. And what you see is, I think, if you look at comparatively across the world at deeply divided societies, you see that those societies where all the different groups, where everyone has a voice in government and can non-violently express their opinions and have the government be accountable to them, those societies are more peaceful for all people than are societies where only one group basically locks another group out. That essentially, that Northern Ireland ultimately is a safer place for Protestants as well as Catholics today, because Protestants gave up the religious supremacy that they had before the Good Friday Agreement. That South Africa is a safer place for white South Africans, like including some of my relatives today, than it would have been had apartheid continued, because ultimately the violence of that discrimination, that denial of rights, ultimately engulfs everybody. And I think that we have been living in some ways in a bit of a fantasy over the last 15 years, because the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has essentially kept things quiet and prevented Israel facing the consequences of the violence they inflict on Palestinians. But I think it's only a matter of time until, if you again remember those terrible and tragic days during the Second Intifada, I think it's only a matter of time until we see round after round, maybe permanent violence that starts to affect Israeli Jews. Well, I certainly would never welcome that, God forbid. But I do think ultimately that our safety and Palestinian safety is intertwined.
Your insight about Palestinians having rights in a state and that condition making things safer for Jews and everyone who are currently Israeli citizens leads into this next question. Amos Oz, Zichrono Livracha, probably would have agreed with you on that point, but he would have characterized it differently. He would have said that your vision is of a marriage in one state, whereas he advocated a divorce in two states.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether the recent violence that you've alluded to of Jewish gangs attacking Palestinian citizens in Lod, Bat Yam, Yafo, and Palestinian gangs attacking Jewish citizens in those places, if that has prompted you to put the pause or prompted you to at all reconsider the sanguine quality with which you view a one-state solution.
No, actually quite the opposite. You know, I mean, again, I think that the problem with his metaphor of divorce is that the Palestinian people is not easily segregated into the boundaries that one might like across the, on the other side of a wall. Again, 20% and rising of Israel's population are Palestinian. I mean, in some ways, the fact that we tend to call them in the Jewish community Arab Israelis, I think sometimes obfuscates the fact that they're part of the Palestinian people. We don't often think about the fact that most of the Palestinians in Gaza and many of the Palestinians in the West Bank are not from there. They're from Israel proper, not to mention all the Palestinians who are refugees. And by the way, the other problem with the divorce analogy is that also we are not easily confined, Jews, to the land, to within the Green Line, right? That is, as I don't need to tell you, the biblical heartland of Israel is not Tel Aviv, right? It's what people call Judea and Samaria, right? It's Hebron, it's Beit Lechem, it's the city that the Bible calls Shechem, which is now Nablus, right? So, ironically, I found that among Israeli Jews, often on the political right, who have a fierce devotion, a devotion that I understand, to the idea of living in biblically precious areas, it is actually often easier for them to imagine living alongside Palestinians in an equal state in which they are allowed to remain in the West Bank than being forced to move back inside Israel proper. And that's why you can sometimes see these remarkable transformations. People like Rabbi Menachem Froman, for instance, whose work I would really recommend people look at, or Hanan Schlesinger, who basically moved to the one-state position as Jewish settlers, deeply devoted to living in the West Bank, and who began to imagine, because they began to interact with Palestinians and saw Palestinian humanity, they were able to imagine living alongside Palestinians as equals and square that with their deep desire to live in this land. And that's why, although I have the most, greatest admiration for Amos Oz and love his writing, I disagree with the divorce analogy. I don't think the marriage is easy, but I think the marriage, in some sense, is inevitable.
Great, thank you so much for that, Peter. I'm going to move to the question of Palestinian refugees. In your recent article in the Jewish Currents, Teshuva, a Jewish case for Palestinian refugee return, you make a moral case for why the Jewish community should understand and support the right of Palestinian refugees to return. You write, and I quote, "In Jewish tradition, return need not be physical. It can also be ethical and spiritual. That means the return of Palestinian refugees, far from necessitating Jewish exile, could be a kind of return for us as well, a return to traditions of memory and justice that the Nakba has evicted from organized Jewish life. The longer Jews deny the Nakba, the deeper our moral exile becomes. By facing it squarely and beginning a process of repair, both Jews and Palestinians in different ways can start to come home. Could you say more about what you mean here about Jewish moral exile, and also about the language of repair that you use in this article in the Israeli-Palestinian context?
Sure. So the linguistic point I was making was that the word tshuva is often generally translated as repentance. But actually its literal meaning is return. So for instance, when people come back to Jewish observance, they're often called a bale tshuva, who's kind of master of return, right? That's not really, that's not a physical return, but it's a kind of spiritual return. Or I think it could be an ethical return. And it seems to me that the organized Jewish community in the United States and other diaspora communities and the Israeli government's refusal to face the magnitude of what happened to Palestinians during Israel's creation, between 1947 and 1949, let's say, has left a tremendous kind of moral void. And I think that I don't think it's quite possible to understand how it is that the kind of American Jewish communal establishment can be so sanguine about, for instance, the continuing expulsion and eviction of Palestinians to this day that we see in places like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and all over the West Bank. Because essentially, any place that a Palestinian is not a citizen, a Palestinian is unlikely to be able to get permission to build a home. But Palestinians still need homes. They have kids. They need places to live. So across East Jerusalem and the West Bank, Palestinians build homes illegally because that's the only way they can build homes. And then they wonder when the bulldozers are going to come. You know, and I've and maybe others on this call too. I've stood in the homes I've stood in homes and in villages where every single structure in that village was slated for demolition. And you think, given our history that was referred to earlier of expulsion, of plunder, right, of the massive plunder of Jewish property and wealth in Europe, how could it be that we, of all people, could be so not just blind to this, but could come up with these slick talking points to somehow, excuse it? And I think it has to do ultimately with the refusal to face the kind of this original massive expulsion, which David Ben Gurion himself called an act of mass plunder. One of the things that I did very explicitly in that essay that you mentioned was I tried as much as possible to rely on Jewish sources to quote what Haganah and Palmach and IDF soldiers were saying and is themselves about what they saw. And the way in which they used language of pogrom, because that's what they were used to, and that's what they had seen themselves in Europe. And so it seems to me that there is a kind of a moral exile that from our best traditions, kind of Judaism is like any great religious tradition, has many, many multiple voices. So I'm not suggesting that Judaism's only voice is a voice of kind of human dignity. It has other voices as well. But it seems to me that still it is striking to me that a tradition, that a people born in slavery in the book of Exodus and told 36 times, according to the Talmud in the Torah, that we should remember the heart of the stranger because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, could have become so deadened to this horror, a horror that has affected virtually every single Palestinian. You will not meet a Palestinian virtually untouched by the Nakba, what Palestinians call a catastrophe. So that's the kind of exile that I speak about. And one of the things that really inspired me in writing this piece was the story I read about a couple named Genya and Heinrich Kowalski, who are Holocaust survivors, who came to Palestine and were in Haifa. And in 1949, were given the keys to a home. They, of course, had been forced out of their own homes in Poland. And they walked into this home in 1949, and they saw that people had been living there recently. And they gave the key back. They said, we should not be treating people this way. And it seems to me that's a kind of a spark, it seems to me, that I feel like has been allowed to almost go out in the Jewish community that I would like to see return, and I would like us to be their moral heirs.
Thank you for that response, Peter. So in advancing your vision of one state, which affords full and equal rights to both Jews and Palestinians, you have made a great effort to couch your analysis and your advocacy within Jewish sources, Jewish history, Jewish values, and your place within the Jewish community. Can you share your reflections on why you choose to do this?
It's first of all just more comfortable for me to do this, because again, although people may find it strange, given, I suppose, how some people perceive me, I don't see myself as a pure universalist. I mean, I do see myself as someone with a particular bond and obligation to the Jewish people, and someone who wants to speak within the language of Jewish tradition and feel myself part of that Jewish tradition, even if I may interpret it differently than other people. I also think that maybe that language can touch some people in a way that a kind of more neutral, universal language of international law and secular human rights, not that there's anything wrong with that at all, that it may not, because essentially that emotionally, the irony is to me that emotionally we understand these things at a very deep level. We understand dispossession. We understand this almost manic desire to preserve memory so that you maintain your identity. And one of the things that I tried to make the point in Tshuva is that if Jews tell Palestinians to forget about the places they're from, we of all people should understand that if you forget where you're from and you stop passing down a memory from generation to generation, right? As we say during the Passover Seder, that you should yourself imagine that you left Egypt. You are basically telling another people to cease to exist, because we know that that's what preserved us, right? It wasn't an army, it wasn't a state. It was essentially a set of texts and a memory and a set of memories that were very lovingly cultivated under difficult circumstances. And it seems to me that there's a really deep irony in us telling Palestinians essentially to forget about it and just move on and become Lebanese or Syrian or Canadian or wherever you happen to have found yourself because you were expelled.
So on this question of identity, I want to link this to the question of the new political alignment in Israel. And I don't expect you to be a prophet, but to the extent that Naftali Bennett has positioned himself to the right of Netanyahu, that he's on record as supporting annexation, he's been quoted as talking about killing Arabs, and at the same time, Mansour Abbas of the Ra'am Party and Islamist Party has elected to be in a government with him.
Yeah.
Does this signal that perhaps there are divisions in Palestinian society and that your advocacy of a one-state solution for Palestinians may be too much too soon?
So, I mean, it is a really fascinating moment in Israeli politics. I guess I would say a couple different things about it. First of all, you mentioned that Mansour Abbas is an Islamist, right? And I think it's worth pausing on that for a second, because we have created in the Jewish conversation this equation now that essentially to be Islamist means to be a kind of an undying rejectionist of Jewish life in the land of Israel, right? And of course, but Mansour Abbas comes from the same political tradition, the Muslim Brotherhood, that Hamas does, right? And I'm not saying that Hamas and Mansour Abbas are the same today, but I am suggesting that one of the things we should learn from Mansour Abbas is about politics, right? That when you actually allow people to participate in a political process in which they can actually advocate for the rights, even if you are a second-class citizen, as Mansour Abbas is, but still have the right to vote, actually that all kinds of things become possible, right? And this notion we have, again, this is not a defense of Hamas. Hamas blew up a bus with a college friend of mine. I have no love lost for them, and their ideology is very much at odds with my view of the world. But it is to what we have this picture of this kind of eternal kind of Palestinian Islamist politics, that essentially it is kind of never ending and eternally genocidal. And in fact, I think what you saw with Mansour Abbas, and even in some ways what you've seen with Hamas too, in the fact with their rewritten charter that they rewrote in 2017, is that actually people respond to political incentives. Islamists respond to political incentives too. When Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, took over in Egypt, even during the 2012 war, he didn't cut ties with Israel. So that's one, I think, intriguing thing. I think what you see with Bennett and Lapid coming together is obviously just this desperate desire to get rid of Netanyahu. And I think it was made possible partly because of his mismanagement of COVID. And also just, I think, the sense that many have that in a Donald Trump-like way, in his efforts to stay in power and protect from the consequences of his corruption, he was really warping the rule of law, even for Israeli Jews, by really assaulting Israel's judicial system. And I think that you also see in Lapid and Bennett this alliance, which has a lot of support among Israeli Jews, to try to change the balance of power vis-a-vis the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's not just Netanyahu; they are also locked out of this coalition. But I think that it's partly the coalition was made possible because there is still really not very much pressure on the Israeli government to really do anything on the Palestinian issue. And because there's not really much pressure on the Israeli government to do anything on the Palestinian issue, you can create a government in which you have someone like Naftali Bennett, again, who was called for annexation, who is on the far right, and someone like Yair Lapid, who's in the center, and Meretz, which is the most progressive Jewish party. And you can put them all together because, and this is the sad part, essentially none of them think that they're going to do anything on the Palestinian question too. They're basically all, in some way or another, basically comfortable with Israel's control over millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights. And that, for me, is unfortunate.
All right, well, thank you for that, Peter. We have sort of ended this first part of the discussion, and with more than 200 people on the call, we have lots and lots of questions. So I'm glad that we are able to sort of try and accommodate as many as possible. Peter, we have one from Jeff Gold, who writes, it is not at all surprising that American Jewish communities are in the midst of profound conflict if and when they attempt to have a discourse on Israel-Palestine. Accusations fly and relationships get shattered. Could you please comment on how you have personally dealt with these controversies, and do you have recommendations for how communities might engage in Israel-Palestine discourse with a modicum of civility? It's very relevant to our community as well.
It's difficult. I mean, my kids are now old enough and they go to Jewish day school to encounter some of these challenges themselves. And one of the things I say to them is that this conversation is not only an intellectual challenge, it's an emotional and communal challenge. And so it's not always about winning a debate. It's also about knowing when is the right time to have that debate, and with whom, and when is not, right? So if you have a classmate, for instance, there are a lot of Israeli kids in your school who have very close relatives who are now feeling very, very threatened and traumatized. Maybe this is not the best. Maybe you feel like you have something worthwhile to say, but maybe this is not the best moment at which to say it. And there are moments when it's just important to listen and not to immediately think about the counterpoint. I'm not always good at this, but I try in my best moments to remember that sometimes I just need to listen to someone's and try to understand where they're coming from. And I don't necessarily need to respond at that moment, or I don't need to try to basically tell them why I can respond, why I have an answer to their various points. And I would just say in that spirit, I don't know, there are 207 people here. I imagine that not all 207 of you agree with everything I've said. And I am very, very deeply grateful to people who come to hear me talk when they know they're going to disagree with me. It says in in Pirkei Avot, in the Mishnah, it says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." And I think that too often in the Jewish community and in the United States more generally, people essentially segment themselves and only listen to people. And that's as true for the left as the right. And so if you are the person who disagrees with everything I've said the most, in some ways you're the person who I think deserves the most kavod for being here. The last point I would make is I think that in terms of Jewish community, I think perhaps the best way to prevent Israel-Palestine from tearing communities apart is to talk about things other than Israel-Palestine. And I think, again, this is my own opinion, I think the thing that binds us most fundamentally as Jews is our relationship to a set of texts. Those texts are much older and in a certain kind of way much bigger than the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I think one of the things that has made me able to be happy at successive different Orthodox synagogues over my entire adult life is a sense of genuine love and joy and devotion that I share with people in terms of Jewish practice, even which bonds us in a way that is separate from our views on this political question. So I would love to see right-wing Orthodox Jews and left-wing Reform or unaffiliated Jews coming together, not to talk about Israel-Palestine, but to study a Jewish text, piece, the Parsha, something from the Talmud that speaks to the human condition. I think that's a way of, that's a way it seems to be forming a kind of connection which is deeper. And then maybe it means that a relationship can be forged that isn't torn apart by this issue.
Thank you for that, Peter. I have another easy one for you. We're only easy ones tonight. So this one came in. A lot of energy continues to be spent on the question of whether anti-Zionism or anti-Israel critiques are expressions of anti-Semitism. While many of us would argue that protests against Israeli actions are not by definition anti-Semitic, we do wonder, and we even worry, that calling for the dissolution of the only state in which Jews possess a strong degree of self-determination crosses into some kind of gray area. Do the recent worldwide protests against Israel, some of which were steeped in serious anti-Semitic tropes, indicate that there is something more going on here than simply moral distress over the occupation and the plight of the Palestinians?
Thank you. There's a lot there. Let me start by saying that there is, of course, anti-Semitism among anti-Zionists and on the left more generally. Anti-Semitism is a very creative malady that finds its ways into all different corners of the political spectrum. The Soviet Union was anti-Semitic, and it was a putatively left-wing, government. And yes, there were people who claimed to be, maybe thought of themselves as defenders of Palestinian rights, who clearly committed anti-Semitic acts over the past few weeks. And I thought that was, and it was horrifying to watch, and I think we need to hold that reality and not deny it and not minimize it, and I'm saying Kaddish for my father. I walk up and I walk up and down the street every day wearing a kippah. So I'm not, I think about, what it means to potentially have anti-Semitic attacks potentially. My kids, they could go to Jewish day school. But I also think it's important for us to hold that all of the Palestinian activists and intellectuals that I am aware of, and I know that, I'm aware of most of the folks, condemned those anti-Semitic attacks very clearly. And what they said was, we are anti-Zionists, we're not anti-Semitic. And I think that it is important to recognize why, for Palestinians, that's not a strange position to take at all. First of all, most Palestinians are not anti-Semitic because they're not hateful, and because they're able to distinguish between the state of Israel and Jewish people. And in fact, also because in most Palestinian activist circles, certainly in the West, certainly in the United States, there are Jews, right? Jews are often very well represented in these spaces. But the Palestinian experience with Zionism has not been a good experience, right? I mean, think of what political Zionism has meant for Palestinians, right? Put aside what it meant for Jews, right? The way we saw it as a movement of national return, a movement of national safety. For Palestinians, it meant a movement of national dispossession. Whether that's the way Zionist leaders, planned it or not, that's a debate for historians. But that's the way it ended up for Palestinians, right? With the dispossession of more than 700,000 Palestinians in 1948, and then continuing dispossessions and millions of people who live under the control of a state where they have either secondary rights or no rights at all. So virtually all Palestinians are going to be anti-Zionists. And Palestinians are overwhelmingly going to want to live in a state where they are equals, just as we would want to in the United States or some other place. And so if we say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, we are essentially saying that virtually all Palestinians, including Palestinians who I know very, very well, Palestinians who I deeply, deeply trust their moral impulses, we're saying they're anti-Semites, and I think that's wrong. So there is if there is a universal right to national self-determination, what it is that there is a right for communal autonomy, for a community to be able to run its own affairs with some degree of autonomy. For instance, for the Basques to be able to have schools in their language, the Kashmiris to have schools to be able to maintain their religious and ethnic traditions, for Jews in Israel to be able to have schools in Hebrew. The universal right to self-determination does not mean that you have the right to a state that gives you rights and privileges that it does not give to your neighbor of a different religion or ethnicity. And I think this is the mistake that people often make when they make this claim about national self-determination in the context of Israel.
Thank you. There's a related question here. And this question comes from Stephen Klingman. And Stephen is from South Africa originally. And I'm going to embellish it slightly to say that, I've been in Israel and I've spoken with Israelis who describe the conditions in the West Bank as apartheid. We had a program at CBI recently where we had an Israeli legal expert who spoke of annexation as apartheid. I know many of us have probably read accusations of apartheid in Israel proper and the West Bank as a veiled, weaponized form of anti-Semitism. Peter, where do you stand on the question of Israel and whether or not to call the situation the Palestinians are facing as apartheid?
So first of all, it's not anti-Semitism. I mean, you can say it's wrong, right? But I mean, I think this is also something we need to try to distinguish in our conversation. I mean, people can make factual observations that you disagree with and you think are wrong, but it doesn't make them anti-Semitic, right? I don't see what's anti-Semitic about calling Israel an apartheid state. It's a claim that there is a system of what B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights organization, one of the two, Yesh Din, another Israeli human rights organization, also now use the term apartheid, of course, along with Human Rights Watch, called a system of Jewish supremacy, by which they meant that everywhere between the river and the sea, Jews have rights that Palestinians don't, even though the rights that Palestinians have vary in different ways. Now, you can argue that point. One could argue, well, Jewish that Palestinian citizens of Israel do have the right to vote and be represented in the Knesset, something that Black South Africans did not have under apartheid. So therefore, at least inside the Green Line, that's a fundamental distinction that means that one should not use the apartheid term inside the Green Line. One could also have an argument about whether it's constructive to use that term. I historically have generally not, because I felt like it gets people's back up, and I found it more effective to simply describe the lived realities as best I could for Palestinians. Again, the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank live under a different legal system than Jews do, so that if a Jew and a Palestinian get into a fight, the Jew goes before a civil court where they have full due process, and the Palestinian goes before a military court where they can be held in indefinite detention, and the conviction rate is north of 99%. To me, I found that that's more effective, and the most effective thing by far is going there and seeing it yourself, right? Because you see it for yourself, and I've seen this again and again, almost irregardless of one's own ideological and political background. You see it for yourself, and you can come up with your own language, but you know it's not right. You just see it and you know this is not right. I think that so there are obviously differences with South Africa. Again, as I mentioned, the Palestinians.
Peter, you froze for a little bit. I think Peter might, we can text him. Hi, Peter, you froze. Would you want to come back? Oh, I think that's what he's going to do.
I'm so sorry about that. I lost Wi-Fi for a second. Anyway, I was just about done. I was just saying that, most of the leaders, many of the key figures from the African National Congress and the South African anti-apartheid struggle, many of whom have been to the West Bank, do see a fundamental commonality there. And it is true, and again, this is disturbing, and it's maybe not something that's pleasant to hear, but there have been reports that Ariel Sharon, for instance, and he was not the only Israeli leader, who was actually looked at the situation of what were called the Bantustans in South Africa, which is essentially where Black South Africans were put in these tribal homelands on small patches of undesirable land, and basically South Africa controlling all the other land, as actually a model. And if you look at the West Bank, right, in which basically you have this archipelago of isolated Palestinian population centers, with Israel controlling the territory in between, and Palestinians not having easy access from one place to another, it's not hard to see the similarity between the policy that existed under apartheid.
Thank you, Peter. So we have another question. Several people on this chat have asked the question, what if Palestinians outnumber Jews in the scenario of a one-state existence where everyone living on the land have equal rights? My question is, if this question was asked of Jews in the US, what if Jews end up outnumbering other communities in the US? Wouldn't that be considered anti-Semitic, and rightly so? Is it at all possible to extend this kind of intolerance of racism towards Palestinians?
Yes, I think this language of demography, comes out of Jewish fear. But I think we need to think about how we would imagine that conversation if it takes place in the United States. And it does take place in the United States, right? If someone like Tucker Carlson or whatever says basically, the percentage of, Hispanics and Muslims and Blacks is getting too high, they're a demographic threat, we would probably, I hope, see that as deeply disturbing, right? And so we need to imagine what it feels like for a Palestinian, including a Palestinian citizen of Israel, to be called a demographic threat when they have a child by their own government, right? And how that makes them feel about their relationship to the state. The truth is that Palestinians probably already outnumber Jews between the river and the sea, if you include Gaza, which I think one should, because Israel, under international law, still occupies Gaza. It doesn't have any people, it doesn't have any soldiers or settlers there, but it occupies Gaza in the way that you could still control a prison, even if the prison guards had left the facility. If they occupied the perimeter and controlled everything and everyone who went in and out, they would still be occupying the prison. So the real question is not whether Palestinians are going to outnumber Jews. It's essentially whether those Palestinians are going to actually have basic rights, like the right to vote or not. I think that even if Jews are not 50% of the population, there is every reason to believe that Jews can advocate for their interests within one binational state, and be able to advocate successfully for their interests. It's not, things might change. Yes, there would be probably some significant redistribution of wealth. right? You know, you wouldn't have a situation where Tel Aviv has 24 hours of electricity and people in Gaza have 4 hours of electricity. There would need to be some effort to deal with those kind of deep economic cleavages. But again, to go back to the South African example, you know, white South Africans are 10% of the population. And it's remarkable. Not only have they not been slaughtered, and believe me, as the child of South Africans, that was a very common belief among white South Africans, that was exactly what would happen if the ANC took power. But actually, they've, you know, for better or for worse, have tended to maintain their economic privilege. Because one of the things we know from American politics is that economic privilege, which Israeli Jews have, is a potent political force. Right, that Israeli Jews would be very well positioned to defend their political interests in one equal state. And I think what you would start to see would be, and I think it would be a very good thing, would be all kinds of new political coalitions emerging in which you had Jews and Palestinians forming political coalitions. And I think what you saw with Mansour Abbas and this right-wing coalition is just a little taste of the kind of politics that you might see break out in one equal state.
Rabbi Jacobson, you're up next.
Okay, I have a question here from Aaron Berman. I agree that the only question is what kind of one state we favor, the one we have or one based upon justice. How do you imagine the political process that will lead to a one state based upon justice?
I don't know. You know, I can't foresee that. It seems right now very, very, very far away. The only thing that seems realistic now is the status quo and maybe more rounds of violence as a result of that status quo. But I do take some heart from thinking about other moments in history when things that seemed impossible became possible because of great kind of moral movements. You know, I mean, I think that we've seen the consequences of that with Black Lives Matter, just in the United States in the last couple of years, and how it was able to change the conversation about certain things. In South Africa, as late as the 1980s, most people, I think, would have found it pretty inconceivable that you would have had a free election in 1994 that would have elected Nelson Mandela. And yet it happened. In the 1940s, as late as the 1940s in the United States, I don't think many people would have imagined that within a generation, you would have white soldiers taking orders from Black officers in the United States Army. And yet the Civil Rights Movement made that possible. So in a sense, movements of people that have a moral vision and are willing to sacrifice for that moral vision can make things that seem impossible possible. And so while I don't have anywhere near a game plan, it's not my position to create one anyway, what I would love to see would be a movement of Jews and Palestinians and other people that spoke in the language of, that spoke about a vision of both peoples living with safety and dignity and freedom in this land together. And I think that there is real potential power in that vision.
Thank you.
I'm going to build on a question from Alice Levine, and this has to do with the responsibility that we have as US Jews to be part of this. And she says that one way to go on this is to say, I'm Jewish, but I'm not Israeli, so I don't have skin in the game. Alternatively, and this is my addition, there are people who may say, I'm Jewish and not Israeli, and therefore I will protest not as a Jewish, not from inside the Jewish community, but against the Jewish community. Can you talk about why you see the systemic violence against Palestinians as the responsibility of all of us as Jews, including those of us who identify as US Jews?
It's an interesting question. Look, I mean, if someone who's, it can't be that only Jews, I guess let me put it this way. I mean, if someone feels more comfortable that for them protesting as an American, even though they're Jewish, and they say, look, it's my tax dollars that are going to do, to fund this oppression of Palestinians, it's not my place to tell them they have to speak as a Jew. But I do think that we have a special moral obligation because the American Jewish communal leadership does play an important role in sustaining essentially unconditional American support for Israel. So we are implicated perhaps in an additional way beyond all other Americans. I think what I would hope is that even Jews who are profoundly opposed to Israel's policies and profoundly, and maybe opposed again to the idea of a Jewish state, as I am, would still see themselves as part of what Rabbi Soloveitchik called a covenant of faith, a covenant of fate with all Jews, which is to say, a sense of mutual obligation with all Jews. Now, it may be difficult for many Jews on the right to imagine that a Jew who did not believe in the idea of a Jewish state would feel that sense of mutual obligation to all Jews. But it seems to, but I believe that that sense of mutual obligation is very important. It has been important throughout Jewish history, and it's important that we have a sense of moral mutual obligation to one another. How we express it may be radically different given our different political views, but I think trying to find ways of expressing that mutual sense of solidarity and obligation, even as one is in profound opposition to the Israeli government and to one's own Jewish organizational leadership, is really, really important.
Thank you, Peter. We have a question from Rhonda Jakowitz, and she asks, do you believe that Israel's neighbors share any responsibility for the plight of the Palestinians? And with that, if I could just put in another question that, we said that we have a very diverse audience. So if somehow with that, you could also sort of talk about, do you, Susan Firestone's comment, because she's, put them quite a few times, so I do want to voice her opinion. Do you have any comments about Palestinian terrorism against Jews?
Yes. So on the first question, absolutely. The truth is that Arab governments have, and this even goes back actually, in many cases before Israel's creation, have essentially acted in their own self-interest and often not in the interest of the Palestinian people at all. So you can see this in many ways. I mean, you can see it in the policies today of the government of Egypt, which helps Israel enforce the blockade of Gaza. Israel is the primary enforcer, but Egypt, because of its hostility to the Muslim Brotherhood, remember, Sisi took power in a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. So for Sisi's own reasons, because he wants to weaken Hamas, he participates in this very inhumane blockade. You also see this, for instance, in the fact that in Lebanon and Syria, that Palestinian refugees do not have citizenship. Which means that it, dramatically impacts their ability to live a good life. Palestinian citizens in Jordan can get citizenship, but not in, as I understand it, in Lebanon and Syria. Certainly not in Lebanon. So that's another example. I mean, another I think example I would give, and this one may be less appealing to some on the call, but I think that by normalizing relations with Israel, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain betrayed the Palestinian people, because essentially they had their own interests. They wanted protection against Iran. They wanted economic commerce. They wanted, frankly, Israel to help protect them against their own people, because Israel provides a lot of the technological surveillance that allows them to, these very repressive governments, to surveil their own people. They did that even though they were undermining the Palestinian cause, because of course, if Israel can get recognition from the Arab world without needing to provide Palestinian rights, it has fewer incentives to do that. So I think there are a whole range of ways in which you can see the way that Arab governments have betrayed the Palestinian people. I don't think that should be surprising to us. I mean, this is the fundamental problem with the Palestinian condition. If there is no government that is accountable to you because you are not a citizen, you're going to get screwed, right? To be stateless is a terrible position in the world, because it means that ultimately you are the victim of state power and you don't get the protection of state power. So you see this is the Palestinian experience in Israel, but it's also the Palestinian experience in a place like Lebanon or Syria. On Palestinian terrorism, yes, absolutely. There's been Palestinian violence that against civilians that I think is wholly morally unacceptable, whether it's suicide bombings that took place in the 1990s and during the Second Intifada, or whether it's Hamas's rockets that now hit Israeli civilians. I myself was a few years ago with my daughter in a miklat, in a shelter in Israel, and it wasn't pleasant. I think where I would part company perhaps with some in the Jewish community is not about the morality of that violence. It's about how to stop it, which is, it seems to me that if you want Palestinians to resist their oppression nonviolently, then you have an obligation to actually show that nonviolence can work. Right? Nonviolence does not always work. I mean, Nelson Mandela was one of the people who turned the African National Congress from a nonviolent organization, which it had been from the beginning of the 20th century until the creation of Mkonte Wesizwe, the military wing, in the 1960s. And he was one of the people who turned it to armed struggle. It was not because Nelson Mandela was bloodthirsty. He just didn't think nonviolence was working. He thought armed struggle might be more effective, right? And so when you respond to the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, whether you support it or not, by criminalizing it and calling all its supporters anti-Semites, right? If this is a nonviolent movement speaking in the language of human rights and international law, right? You're basically telling Palestinians, well, we're going to make sure that your nonviolent efforts fail. When you respond to Mahmoud Abbas, who for 15 years has been doing security cooperation with Israel to make sure that there are not too many violent attacks from the West Bank. And basically Israel responds to that by basically building more and more settlements and making a Palestinian state impossible. You are doing Hamas's work for it, because you're basically convincing Palestinians that the nonviolence doesn't work. And so there are a lot of Palestinians I know who will say, do I like Hamas? No. Do I like the idea of launching rockets? No. But you know what? At least it got us on the front page. At least it got people talking about our plight. What did Mahmoud Abbas get for us with his nonviolent efforts of strategy of negotiation and security cooperation? Nothing. We basically just suffer silently. So I think if you oppose violence, you have an obligation to actually treat violence and nonviolence differently.
Thank you for that, Peter. Here's a question from one of our local colleagues, Rabbi Ricky Kosofsky. Peter, who are your philosophical partners in the Jewish world and the Palestinian and Arab world? Whatever happens, I think leaders with this creative and radical edge are critical to making a peaceful solution possible.
I suppose the Palestinian thinkers that have most influenced me, and I would say not just intellectually, but emotionally, have been Palestinians who have been able to see past their own pain and have an empathy for the Jewish experience, and even an empathy for Zionism, even as they have seen it as a force that has crushed them. And I think that's very, very difficult to do, but it's something that Edward Said was able to do in his writings, in which he could say, of course I see Zionism as a settler colonial movement. That's in fact what it looked like to us. And I think in fact, objectively, political Zionism did have settler colonial features. In fact, many of the early Zionists used the term colonialism as a positive term, as it was at that time. But Said could also say, I understand why Jews, given their own experience, would see it differently. And that kind of empathy I found very, very moving and compelling. In terms of Israeli Jews, Yeshayahu Leibovitz was a Israeli intellectual, Orthodox Israeli intellectual who spoke very powerfully against, I think, what the occupation was doing to Israel, and what it was even doing to Judaism inside Israel. And there are also people now, people who really, struggle, the people who for years have been going and protesting, Israeli Jews have been going and protesting in places like Bilin or in Sheikh Jarrah. There was an Israeli academic I knew who was at Princeton, and she decided to leave Princeton and go back to Tel Aviv University, even though she could have made a very good life for herself here. And she said to me, I said, do you see any hope for change in Israel? And she said, no, I feel like an abolitionist in the 1820s, she said, basically. She said, it may not be my place to see that change, but it may be my place to try to preserve something for the next generation to pick up. And that was very moving for me. And given that, of course, I live in the relative comfort and safety of the United States, I feel like part of what I do, and what any of us I hope would do, is to do our part in solidarity with those Palestinians and Israeli Jews on the ground. Another person is a friend of mine named Fadi Karan, who lives near Ramallah. He became really interested when he was at Stanford in studying the Jewish role in the civil rights movement. And so when he went back to Ramallah, he started organizing freedom rides in which Palestinians would get on buses in Ramallah and say, we want to go to Jerusalem. But the buses, of course, only take Jews to Jerusalem. And he asked me at one point, he said, I know the Jewish role in the civil rights movement was so remarkable. How could we get Jews to join our civil rights movement? Anyway, those are the kind of people that I feel like I want to be in solidarity with.
So on the heels of that, I want to come back to cultural Zionism. And there are many, many figures and groups like Combatants for Peace and Breaking the Silence, who would, and an author like David Grossman, my hero, people who would identify with the cultural Zionist tradition as you have. And here I'm synthesizing a number of questions. Let's say the one state solution comes about. And let's say all the factionism between Israel, Jewish society and Palestinian society produces a Lebanon-like situation, and we have a failed state. Does that prospect and sort of the death of the dream of cultural Zionism give you any concern, even as you advocate for a one-state solution?
Sure. I mean, I don't think that life in politics in one equal binational state will be easy. It's not easy in South Africa. There are many unresolved issues and deep tensions that remain. It's not easy in our own country, right? Where we see how, even 150 years after slavery and 50 plus years after Jim Crow, we still have such deep wounds and divisions. I think, to me, the question is essentially, what's the trajectory? Are you trying, even in a very fitful way, towards moving towards justice and equality, and towards looking honestly at your past and trying to heal it and face it honestly, or are you essentially continuing to inflame the wound and piling more injustice upon injustice? So, and I think, to me, one has to weigh, those are the two choices, the relative balance of risks. I do think that Israel, Palestine would have many advantages that Lebanon did not. And so I think it's worth just noting some of the important differences. First of all, we know that from comparative political science work that stability of liberal democracy tends to correlate with things like per capita income and literacy levels. Israel, Palestine has significantly higher per capita income and literacy levels than Lebanon does. And by the way, it's not only among Israeli Jews. Among Palestinians, literacy levels are extremely high, significantly higher than a lot of other places in the Middle East. Lebanon was also a very weak state. So part of the tragedy of Lebanon was that essentially Lebanon was invaded and dominated by at various points, both Israel and Syria. Israel-Palestine will be a much stronger state, and I think less likely to face kind of the predatory kind of moves on its soil that Lebanon was suffered from. Israel-Palestine, like apartheid South Africa, has a set of institutions that work for one segment of the population that actually genuinely do put restraints on power. Right. So, for instance, Israel has a media and an independent judiciary that puts restraints on executive power. It's very, very important. Those those systems don't work nearly as well for Palestinians, but it's a base upon which one can build. And I think this is, again, one of the reasons that apartheid South Africa had an advantage over some other post-colonial African states, is they had these liberal institutions. It's just they were confined to one racial group, but essentially they provided something on which to build that you didn't have in, let's say, the Congo or Nigeria or certain other countries that were gaining independence.
Thank you, Peter. So, in your article on the Palestinian refugee return, you use a lot of language that is a language of repair. And there's a lot of talk about acknowledgement. And so somebody in the chat, Rosie McMahon, asks, what role do you see apology playing in resolving this issue?
I think it's very important. It's very important. I mean, we're seeing, let's just try to think about it from our perspective as Jews, right? Of course, I'm not equating the Holocaust to the Nakba. The Nakba was not an act of mass murder in the way the Holocaust was. But how important is it for us as Jews that leaders of governments and countries that were complicit in that have apologized and made amends? I remember this famous moment when Willy Brandt, the Prime Minister of West Germany, went to the memorial at the Warsaw Ghetto and knelt. He went to Poland, a country that Germany had occupied, and he went to the Warsaw Ghetto and he got on his knees. I think that we, again, it's not to equate the Nakba but we know that there is deep healing power in that. It's not enough, but it's a beginning. And again, I think that's something that we're starting to reckon with in the United States too, with our historical crimes. That if you read Ta-Nehisi Coates and other people, they say that it starts with a reckoning, with an acknowledgement, and from there things become possible that aren't possible otherwise.
Thank you so much. This question, Peter, is about coexistence organizations. And the question from Carolyn Oppenheim, is there an organization in Israel that you see as doing a good job bringing Jews and Israeli Palestinians together that would be good for American Jews who want to support your vision?
So I guess I would mention two. I mean, I think that the political party in Israel that I would most identify with is Hadash, which is a communist party, which is generally called an Arab party. It's led by Ayman Odeh, but actually always has one of its Knesset members is who is a Jew. And I think actually, if you look at Ayman Odeh and the way he speaks, I think he speaks about a language of equality. And if you look at Ayman Odeh's career, in Knesset, for instance, he fought to get more payments for Holocaust survivors from the Israeli government. This was a guy who's genuinely shown a deep concern for the welfare of all people in Israel. An organization that I find really inspiring and whose work I relied on a little bit in my essay, Tshuva, is an Israeli organization called Zochrot, which is an organization of Israeli Jews, but also Palestinians, and it means memory, remember, and it tries to cultivate, to bring awareness of the memory of what happened to Palestinians in 1948 to Israeli Jews. Not an easy thing to do, and I think that's that kind of work I find really inspiring.
So I have a question from Henny Lewin, which is a comment on your interpretation of Edward Said. I feel it's very appropriate in a Jewish conversation that we have a question about interpretation. And you spoke how you were impressed with Edward Said's empathy towards the Jewish people and even Jewish people living in Israel. But Henny's view of Edward Said is very different, in which her interpretation is that Said believed that all the land from the river to the sea belongs to the Palestinians. And the question isn't so much about who's right on Edward Said, but I think the question for you, Peter, is might you be overestimating the willingness of Palestinians to live in one state with Jews?
So just briefly on Said, I mean, Said was very clear that he opposed evictions of Jews from their homes, even if those homes had been Palestinian homes. That he believed actually that there should be both that there should be both a Jewish and a Palestinian right to come and move to Israel, Palestine. I think that again, I would recommend. I mean, there's a lot of things that Said wrote. I mean, his kind of big book on this is called The Question of Palestine. But for a shorter sense of how he felt, particularly at the end of his life, I would suggest his 1999 New York Times Magazine essay, where he tries to lay out his vision of one state. And secondly, this remarkable interview he did late in his life with the Israeli journalist Ari Shavit, where Shavit presses him very hard on the question of his vision for Jews in one equal state. And I think you'd be very hard pressed to read that and suggest that Said is suggesting that Jews should not be allowed to live safely and freely there. I think that there is the same distribution of human personality types among Palestinians as there is, among everybody else. But I do think that the dominant voice among Palestinian activists and intellectuals is one that speaks in the language of equality. And equality is a two-sided coin, right? Equality means not just equality for Palestinians, but equality for Jews. It would not be possible to have so many Jews involved in that Palestinian struggle were that not the vision that is laid out. So I suppose it may be difficult to convince some Jews of that, but I would say, test the proposition, test it, go and seek out Palestinians or Palestinians in the diaspora who maybe, and ask them, I can only speak, I can speak best from my own experience, but I interact with a lot of Palestinians and read a lot of Palestinian writing. Again, I can't claim to be, to have, a full understanding of all of the different, of an entire population. But I am struck again and again and again by even how people who are most militant in their opposition to Zionism express a vision of equality. And a vision of human rights. And I think it is the dominant vision in the Palestinian national movement today. And so I think that it doesn't mean that Palestinians are angels, but I think ultimately you have to make a decision. Do you think that people are going to be more likely to live with you and treat you decently if they have basic rights, or if they don't, if they've been subjected to massive amounts of state violence? What do you think is more likely to create a climate, right, in which there's going to be goodwill and empathy towards Jews?
Peter, the next question is from Tamar Fields. It is my understanding that it is illegal for Israelis to travel to the West Bank. This seems like an intentional strategy to prevent Israeli Jews from being able to experience the human cost of occupation and the humanity of Palestinians. Can you comment on this?
So it's not as illegal for Israelis to travel to the West Bank. There are many Israelis who live in the West Bank. It is officially, Israelis are not supposed to travel to, or at least not supposed to spend the night in Area A, which are the Palestinian population centers, which are supposedly under full Palestinian control, even the control of the Palestinian Authority, even though in reality the Israeli army can go in there anytime it wants. And in fact, as I understand it, those rules are not actually enforced for Palestinian citizens of Israel, but they are sometimes enforced for Jewish citizens of Israel. I don't honestly know if the purpose is to prevent Israeli Jews from having contact with Palestinians, or whether the Israeli government may genuinely feel that those people could be at some security risk, they could get themselves in trouble, and then it would be a headache for the Israeli government to deal with them. But I do think that there is unfortunately far too little interaction between Israeli Jews and Palestinians in a condition that would really facilitate dialogue, not in the condition of an Israeli soldier and a Palestinian without basic rights, but in a situation of enough equality that you could actually have a real kind of human empathy and understanding start to emerge. And I think that, I'll plug an organization called Unhcr. Some of you may have heard of it, which takes American Jews to meet Palestinians in the West Bank. It's a very powerful experience for people often. And one of the things Unhcr's been doing recently, which is great, is they've started taking Israeli Jews as well to do that. And I think that kind of thing is very important.
Okay, let's see. Okay, this is a question from Josh Platt. I wonder if a one-state solution would facilitate better economic and political relationships between Israel and other Arab nations. I wonder what the regional picture looks like with this proposed solution.
It's an interesting question. I can't say I really know. Look, the truth of the matter is, that Israel economically is doing very well now, and it's also making inroads into the region. So maybe I'm arguing against my own position here, but I don't necessarily know that arguing that Israel needs this economically is the strongest argument, because Israel has, again, is developing ties to the UAE, to Bahrain, and has, very economically integrated in many different parts of the world. I do think that that an equal binational state could be a way for Israeli Jews to certainly I do think that with one binational state, the remaining Arab governments would cease their boycott of Israel. There would be no justification for that whatsoever. So I do think that therefore that Israeli Jews would be fully accepted in the region, and I do think that would maybe allow for even greater economic possibilities that are today. But again, it's I can't. Israel is truthfully doing pretty well even as it is economically. And the people, by the way, and let me just say something about, there were a lot of people in my camp on the left who were saying 5 years ago or 10 years ago that Israel, if it continued on its policies, would be totally economically isolated. That's turned out not to be the case. Benjamin Netanyahu was right. He said, we can do this and we won't be economically isolated. And he turned out to be right in that prediction, at least so far.
Peter, I want to pick up on what you said about Unhcr, and I have to agree, it's a fantastic organization. A number of us have been to the West Bank, as well as in Israel proper, to visit projects supported by an organization called Healing Across the Divides, that provides seed money to local preventative health organizations on both sides of the Green Line. And frequently when we meet with Palestinian organizations, they're professionals who are incredibly dedicated, who at some point in their presentation speak about anti-normalization, which for them means not meeting with their co-professionals who are Israeli. What do you think of this position, and might it signal that perhaps Palestinians aren't ready to live in a one-state solution, in a binational state alongside Israelis?
I don't think that's a fair interpretation. I think that what Palestinians are objecting to with anti-normalization is the normalization of a reality in which they are essentially expected to kind of embrace an idea of coexistence in which they don't have equality, in which they don't have basic rights. And again, I think that it's not exactly the same. You can kind of imagine in American context that if you want to do coexistence between white and Black Americans might say, well, the work we would like to do with you is to struggle for our rights. We're not necessarily interested in just having some kind of dialogue group for the sake of dialogue or something like that, right? We want to be part of we want to change this unjust reality. We don't want to kind of paper it over. Now that said, again, I as a non-Palestinian, I don't always have access to what's happening. I don't have access to these internal conversations, but I do worry that the anti-normalization movement could prevent interactions and conversations that could be important in changing the way Israeli Jews think. So I do worry that, if it can potentially shut down a dialogue that, although Palestinians may feel like it's frustrating to them, that ultimately could be a dialogue that has real power in affecting the way Israeli Jews see things. And just to give one example, interesting. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the app Clubhouse. I wasn't familiar with it up until recently, but it's this new app that basically it's kind of audio app where it's like you were in a hall virtually and people just get up on stage and start talking. And when the war broke out, they created one of Israelis and Palestinians, including people in the diaspora. And it went on 24 hours a day for like 2 or 3 weeks. And the conversations were really remarkable. And I do think it gave a lot of Israeli Jews an opportunity to hear about what life was like for Palestinians in a way that they might not have, because the Israeli media does not do a good job, I think, generally of conveying what life is like for Palestinians. And so I do think that those conversations are important. And I do worry that the anti-normalization movement may limit the possibility of those interactions.
A somewhat related question is from Rabbi David Seidenberg. He says, Palestinians involved with Israel and human rights know how to speak about these things, but the Free Palestine movement includes so many people that have zero connection to or experience of the reality and are only interested in demonizing Israelis and have no capacity to empathize with a Jewish pro-Israel perspective. How does Peter suggest talking to them, or should we just ignore them?
That's a difficult question. I guess it depends on who exactly one is talking about. I mean, I do think that we have every right as Jews to, if we are in spaces that are organized around the idea of Palestinian freedom and feel like they're dehumanizing Jews, or they're not projecting a vision in which also insists on the right of Israeli Jews to live not with special rights, but with the same rights, and with the rights that with the right to be safe and free and to have human dignity. That if people that if that's not being done, that we should challenge that. And if it doesn't make people happy, sometimes it doesn't make people happy. But again, I think that we first of all, I think it's the moral thing to do, since I think that as a simple matter of human rights, the human rights of Israeli Jews are precious. But I also think, as I said before, that we have the right as Jews to speak up for Jews, and have a sense of mutual obligation and solidarity to our fellow Jews, not at the expense of Palestinian rights, but if people are, but if no one is doing that in a given space, then of course it should be us, right? And again, is it also, as it says in Pirkei Avot, in the place where there is no man, be a man, which is very gendered and sexist language. I appreciate, but you could say that, essentially, if it's it's an interpretation of Moses, essentially standing up for when the Jew is being beaten by the Egyptian overseer, he looks around and sees nobody else there, and essentially he acts himself. So I think if there's a place where Jews are being dehumanized and people are not conscious of Jewish rights, Jewish legitimate rights to safety and dignity and freedom, then yes, as Jews, we should speak up for those.
Thank you, Peter. Here's another question about organizations to support. Can you suggest some resources for Americans who want to support the rights of Palestinians without doing harm to the Jewish community by inadvertently promoting anti-Semitism? And that's from Annie Durrani.
Right. Sure. I mean, I think that there are organizations, an organization like Adala, which advocates for the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. I think my friend Isa Amro, who's a really remarkable man who, nonviolent human rights activist in Hebron, has a local group there called Youth Against Settlements. Yes, I think there are such organizations, and I think that they're very, very valuable to support. And Unhcr is the Palestinian kind of civil and human rights organization. So yeah, absolutely. I think that there's very valuable work I think they're very important Palestinian organizations one can support.
So I want to ask a question about language. This was pointed out by Adila Massoud and also Felicia Mednick, who asks, I wonder if part of the problem is that Jews have at times projected the images and memories of Nazis onto Palestinians. And if you want to expand that to include projections the other way as well.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think that I think there are a couple things at play. I think, first of all, there is in Jewish tradition this notion of the eternal unyielding enemy that reemerges in different guise, but with the same basic essence in every generation, right? It starts really with the figure of Esau, and then goes to, you know, the figure of Agag, to the Amalek, the Amalekites, Agag, Haman. And so I think there is something in Jewish tradition that tends to imagine this as a recurring tendency. And then I think, of course, it's been dramatically exacerbated by the experience of European anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And so you do see again and again, you know, people explicitly, I mean, but Begin used to do this all the time. I mean, you know, he described he said I think he said something along the lines of, when justifying the Lebanon war, you know, he basically said, it's this or Treblinka. You know, Abba Eban's famous line about Auschwitz borders, right? The 67 lines were Auschwitz borders. You saw, you know, again and again, people talk about the West Bank. If you removed settlements, they refer to it as Judenrein, right? As if to remove Israeli settlers, so they went back into Israel proper, when they are basically their presence there, they were living there with rights that Palestinians didn't have, often on stolen land, is the equivalent of, you know, Poland or Lithuania or Germany, expelling all of its Jewish population. So yes, even this language of right to exist, right? Or the, you know, when I say I support one equal state, people will often say, oh, so you oppose Israel's right to exist. You want to destroy, annihilate the Jewish state, right? Whether people recognize it or not, this language, I think, triggers something about the notion of genocide. And I think it's why Jews are so quick to pick up on any Palestinian action that could be seen in that light, and so often essentially filter out the Palestinian discourse, which is not in that light. And the problem with it is that, among other things, if you see Palestinians as Nazis, and you see Jews as the equivalent of people on the verge of genocide, and you know that it's always 1938, you essentially end any conversation about Jewish moral responsibility, because after all, what moral responsibility do Jews have in the Warsaw Ghetto except to survive, right? And if that's your template, then you can do whatever you want to the Palestinians, because it's all justified in the name of survival, and it completely erases any grappling with power, with this radically unusual, you know, with the fact that Israel is a powerful state that controls millions of people, of non-Jews, who lack basic rights. And I think that when we think about Jewish tradition, we often don't think very much about we always often think about this Jewish story as this story of victimhood and survival, and rarely think about those moments, even in our own tradition, where we're encouraged to think about the moral responsibilities of power. So for instance, I think very many Jews, often in my experience, think the Megillas Esther, the book of Esther, ends essentially with Jews being saved from Haman, right, from Haman. But it actually ends with this massive act of Jewish revenge in which 75,000 people are killed, right, by Jewish forces, right? Or the story of Hanukkah is narrated as Jews gaining freedom from the Syrian Greeks, right? And then rededicating the temple, right? And how often do you ever hear a conversation about what the Hasmonean dynasty, the Hasmoneans became once they gained power, right? Including the fact that people like, John Hyrcanus, forcibly converted the populations under their kingdom after the Hasmoneans had taken power, before the Romans took over. So there is a Jewish tradition of grappling with the moral responsibilities of power, and yet I actually think that that we often tend to ignore it in our own understanding of Jewish tradition.
Thank you for that, Peter. I do want to be mindful of the fact that Peter does have to say Kaddish every night for his late father. May his memory be for a blessing. So I do want to, be mindful of that. Peter, would you be able to take maybe another 3 questions?
Sure. Yeah, I have till 8:05 or 8:10.
Oh, okay, wonderful. We'll, yes, we'll definitely let you go by 8 o'clock. So we have a question from Adik. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. How much influence does American Christian Zionism have in the oppression of Palestinians by the Israeli government?
I think it has a lot of influence, especially in the Republican Party, because that's where the white Christian evangelical presence is strongest, so I think that it's a powerful force. The reasons that white Christian evangelicals identify so strongly with Israel are interesting and complicated. I think it has partly, again, to do with their theology. I think it has also to do with their, frankly, Islamophobic sentiments, that they essentially see Israel as this kind of tip of the spear of Western civilization in the Muslim world, and I also think, and this is the most disturbing part of it, but the other is disturbing too, but I also think, frankly, that, and you see this very clearly in Tucker Carlson, you see it in Ann Coulter and other people, that for many conservative white Americans in the Trump era, what they want is they want a definition of Americanism which maintains certain kind of ethnic and religious and racial hierarchies, and they see in Israel a country that does maintain those hierarchies. So, for instance, one of the things that Tucker Carlson said just recently was that he would like America to have an immigration policy like Israel, right? Because Israel has an immigration policy that's based on maintaining its demographic character, which essentially means that you can come and become a citizen immediately, but it's virtually almost impossible to move to Israel as a non-Jew and become a citizen. So I think that that's part of what you see as the conservative white evangelical identification with Israel. Israel is a kind of there is a kind of religio-ethnic supremacy that exists in Israel, and although it's not exactly the same, they would like a version of that in the United States.
Peter, here's a question from Susan Firestone. Why are you speaking as if Palestinians have no agency? They have rejected each chance for a state beginning in 1947.
I don't think I'm speaking about Palestinians as having no agency. I talked about a variety of different Palestinian efforts at opposing occupation. This narrative about the Palestinians rejecting, one could go on at great length, but let me just give a couple of data points. The partition that was offered in 1947 by the United Nations was for the Jewish state to have 55% of the land and Palestinians, the Arab state, to have 43% of the land. 2% would be Jerusalem as an international city. Palestinians were 66% of the population. They were 2/3 of the population. They were being offered 43% of the land in their state. That wasn't a very good deal for them. In fact, that's part of the reason that essentially the Jewish state was non-viable, because since Jews were only 1/3 of the population and were being given 55% of the land, the dirty secret that we tend not to focus on is that in the Jewish state, in the partition plan, it would have had an almost 50% Arab population, at least 40%, depending on how you do the math, right? So it wasn't crazy for Palestinians to reject that plan. And then if you want to look at the 2000-2001 Arafat-Barak negotiations, or the 2007-2008 Olmert negotiations, I write about these in a little bit of detail in my book, The Crisis of Zionism. It's simply not true that the Israelis offered the Palestinians everything the Palestinians wanted, and the Palestinians said no. Israel made offers to the Palestinians. You know what? Palestinians made offers to the Israelis, but there was a gap between the two positions. The Israeli governments always wanted to annex 6, 8, 10% of the West Bank because they wanted to incorporate settlements into Israel. The Palestinians were only comfortable with a 1 to 3% annexation and land swap. The Israeli government wanted to maintain Israeli control over the Jordan Valley. Barak wanted for 12 years. The Palestinians said, you have to get your troops out of the Jordan Valley within 3 to 5 years. The Palestinians wanted a Palestinian state in all of East Jerusalem. Barak was willing to give them part of East Jerusalem. The Palestinians wanted some refugee return. Abbas reportedly asked for 100,000 refugees. Olmert was willing to offer 5 or 10 or 15,000 refugees. So this was a differences, but it's simply not the case that Palestinians that were purely rejectionist. They had a different vision of what two states would look like, and they feared that Israel's vision would leave their state as not fully sovereign, and not with enough territory to be viable.
Thank you.
Oh, someone mentioned Sam Vahor, and just Sam is fabulous, and I would highly recommend anything that he writes and says. And if you have the chance to meet him, he's extraordinary.
So often in these conversations, we run into accusations of being idealists, and that the realists have the answers. And the question is, well, what's the reality? And in the question. In the chat, someone raised the reality. Well, I forgot the exact number, but I think it was something like 800,000 European Jews, 800,000 Jews were displaced from Arab lands who came to Israel. Someone else other people have talked about the reality of persistent hatred on both sides. Do you see these realities, and do they challenge your idealism about a one-state solution?
I mean, I guess I've had enough experiences to give me a sense of a sense of hope about what's possible. I mean, you know, I've just met enough Palestinians who have endured tremendous trauma, who nonetheless are fighting for a vision of equality and freedom for everybody. And I do, maybe it is a statement of faith, but I do believe ultimately that that human beings desire the same basic things, and that very few people at the end of the day really want to either kill or be killed. You know, the story of the Jews from the Arab world is a story that has always fascinated me, because I said, my grandmother was born in Egypt. She was the most right-wing member of our extended family. And she was always talking about how you couldn't trust Arabs, you know, and it was bizarre to me, because Arabic was, you know, she grew up speaking Arabic in Egypt. So it seemed to me that to some degree, she was essentially almost deriding the Arabness in herself. And I think that there's a fascinating book that helped me understand my own family on that side by Rachel Shabi, who's an Iraqi-Israeli British journalist, called "We Look Like the Enemy." And Shabi argues that the reason that Mizrahi Jews have been politically to the right and in Israel is not because they hate Arabs as a result of their experience in the Arab countries. It's because, especially in the 50s, there was so much anti-Mizrahi racism against them that in order to prove their Jewishness in an Ashkenazi-dominated Israel, they essentially had to reject their own Arabness. So, for instance, you know, you could speak Yiddish on the street, but you couldn't speak Arabic on the street. You couldn't refer to yourself as an Arab Jew, even though that's what many of these people were. I think that Jews like my grandmother, who have left Egypt or left Morocco or Iraq, should have the right to seek the restitution for their property. And if they want to return to those countries, they should have the right to return to those countries. In fact, actually, Morocco is quite interested in having Jews in Morocco. It differs country to country. But it seems to me there's something, those Mizrahi Jews at least did have a state to go to where they were citizens, even though they were discriminated against. Palestinians did not have such a thing. And I think that's why the analogy is problematic. I also think it's just strange to me to say that if you believe that Mizrahi Jews have the right to return if they want and the right to compensation, then so should Palestinians. It seems to me that the moral equation is the same. And so I don't understand why people appeal to the Mizrahi Jewish experience as a way of negating the Palestinian experience.
Very interesting. And Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that under, well, I think that the Palestinian refugees are the only refugees in the entire world who do not have UNHCR protection, which is the UN Refugee Agency, and all other refugee caseloads do. And Palestinian refugees also do not have the option of voluntary repatriation that all other refugees do. And that voluntary repatriation is one of the durable solutions that refugee law provides to every single refugee, but the Palestinian refugees are excluded from that. So I think maybe we can just do one more round of questions. Peter, you've been so patient and so wonderful and gracious about sort of responding to all of them. I'm actually going to combine two very quick questions for my turn. So Mark Jacobson asks, what would a single state solution do to women's rights and gender rights? And Fahim Kazi asks, does the one-state solution have support in the Arab world? So unrelated, but why don't you go ahead anyway?
I mean, you know, the Arab countries embraced the idea of two states with the what's called the Arab Peace Initiative, or the Saudi Peace Initiative, where they said we will recognize Israel if Israel returns to the 67 lines. Then they amended it to say land swaps were also okay, and there was what they called a just and agreed upon solution to the refugee problem. But I think ultimately, probably Arab governments would, you know, if the Palestinian national movement endorse the idea of one state, I think Arab governments probably by and large would as well. The move from the Palestinian national movement essentially did support one state until the 80s, when it moved towards embracing two states, really out of kind of necessity, because of the sense that seemed like the best option. I mean, in terms of what one state would look like in terms of women's rights and LGBT rights, I mean, just look at the Palestinian citizens of Israel. I mean, it's, you know, what you see is they are divided between social conservatives and social liberals on questions like women's rights, religion, and LGBT rights, right? So Hadash is very progressive on those issues, and Ram, which is Mansour Abbas's Islamist party, is very conservative. That's one of the reasons that they broke apart, because they have that division. And you know, guess what? So do Jewish Israelis, right? You have Shas and Degel HaTorah as Haredi parties, which are very conservative, and you have very, parties like Meretz and Yesh Atid that are very progressive on this issue. I think it's quite possible that in one state where you had genuine politics, you would see Jews and Palestinians forming political coalitions. Maybe business owners on both sides would form political coalitions, and social conservatives might form political coalitions on both sides. I mean, again, I wouldn't be thrilled by the possibility of a kind of Jewish Palestinian alliance, you know, which had a regressive view on LGBTQ rights and abortion rights. It would, you know, it reminds me a little bit of that old Woody Allen joke where he said, I won 2 weeks at interfaith camp, he says, where I was sadistically beaten by boys of all races and creeds, right? So I mean, I don't love the idea of ecumenical homophobia or ecumenical misogyny, but the reality is that I think you would find that actually there were Jews and Palestinians on both sides of these debates, and that politics would play out on that basis.
I'm not sure if we want to conclude our program on that note with the Woody joke, but I'm afraid our time has come to an end, and we would like to end on a note of gratitude. So, Peter, we would like to thank you so very much for sharing so openly and passionately with us tonight. We are grateful for your sharing your insights and perspectives on what we know to be very difficult issues, and for giving us this chance to be in dialogue with you. You have given us really a lot to think about and debate. on a topic dear to many of our hearts. So Peter, toda rabba, we thank you very, very much. We also want to thank Mehlaqa Samdani, who is our immensely talented and thoughtful director of Critical Connections. She has grown this organization now 8 years later to one that offers rich and critical programs on contemporary issues of the day, with thought leaders from all across the spectrum of the caliber we have enjoyed tonight. So Mehlaqa, we're so grateful to you. Finally, our thanks to Rabbi Justin David for your very full and generous participation in this program tonight. And as always, Justin, for your spiritual and social justice leadership in this community on a whole variety of issues. Finally, we thank the audience for being with us tonight, and we look forward to your ongoing participation in future Critical Connections programs. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Peter. And Rabbi Devorah Jacobson, thank you for your fearless leadership. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi David.
Thank you.
Good night, Peter. Laila Tov.